The fluorescent lights in Seattle General Hospital's waiting room buzzed overhead, like trapped insects casting harsh shadows across the rows of uncomfortable plastic chairs. I was clutching my phone when it rang, the sound cutting through the antiseptic quiet like a blade. Victoria's name appeared on the screen, and I felt that familiar flutter of hope. Maybe she was calling to check on my appointment, to ask how I was feeling after 6 months of struggling through widowhood alone. "Mom?" Her voice was flat, businesslike. Not the voice of a daughter calling her recently widowed mother. "Victoria, sweetheart, I'm just waiting to see Dr. Martinez. How are you?" "We're leaving for London tomorrow. Edward and I found an incredible investment opportunity. I've already sold the cabin and Dad's truck. We needed the capital." The words hit me like a physical blow, each one landing with precision in my chest. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles whitening. "You... what?" "The cabin brought $40,000. The truck was harder to move. You know how Dad babied that thing, but we found a collector who paid $8,000. I deposited your share in your account. $15,000 total. That should last you a while if you're careful with your spending." My share. Of my own property. Of the cabin where we'd spent 28 summers watching orcas migrate through the San Juan Islands, where Victoria had taken her first steps on the weathered deck, where Thomas had proposed to me 30 years before she was born. "Victoria, you can't just sell." "It's done, Mom. Look, I know this is hard, but you need to be realistic about your situation. Dad didn't leave much, and you can't maintain 2 properties on Social Security. We're helping you simplify your life." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Helping me simplify. As if my memories were clutter to be cleared out. "We'll send postcards," she continued, her voice already distant, already moving on to more important things. "Don't worry about us, and don't worry about money. We'll take care of you when we get back." The line went dead. I sat there in that plastic chair, surrounded by the quiet suffering of the waiting room elderly patients, with oxygen tanks, young mothers bouncing feverish babies, middle-aged men avoiding eye contact with their own mortality. And something inside me shifted. Not broke, shifted like tectonic plates finding a new alignment after decades of pressure. For 6 months, since Thomas died of a massive heart attack at our breakfast table, I'd been drowning in grief so profound, I could barely function. Victoria had stepped in to help with the complicated financial matters, and I'd been grateful. Too grateful to ask questions, too devastated to read the documents she put in front of me, too lost in my own pain to notice the calculating look in her eyes when she thought I wasn't watching. But now, holding that silent phone, I remembered something Thomas had said 3 days before his death. He'd been unusually quiet that morning, standing at our bedroom window watching October rain streak the glass. "Maggie," he'd said, without turning around, "there's an envelope in my desk drawer, the bottom one under the old route maps. If something happens to me, don't open it right away. Wait until you're strong enough to fight for what's yours." At the time, I'd thought he was being overly dramatic. Thomas was a metro bus driver, methodical and careful with money, but not given to mysterious pronouncements about envelopes and fighting. After he died, so suddenly collapsing between one heartbeat and the next while pouring maple syrup on his pancakes, I'd forgotten all about the envelope in the chaos of funeral arrangements and Victoria's helpful interventions. Dr. Martinez called my name. The examination was routine, blood pressure slightly elevated, but normal for a 71-year-old widow, she said with professional kindness. My heart was strong, she assured me. Stronger than I knew, apparently. As I walked to the bus stop afterward through Seattle's persistent drizzle, Thomas's words echoed in my mind with new urgency. Wait until you're strong enough to fight for what's yours. Maybe that time had finally come. The envelope was exactly where he'd said it would be, nestled in the bottom drawer of his roll-top desk, beneath yellowed metro route maps and maintenance schedules from buses that had been retired years ago. My name was written across it, in his careful, precise handwriting, the same handwriting that had filled 46 years of birthday cards and anniversary notes. Inside, I found legal documents that made no immediate sense: property deeds with addresses I didn't recognize, business registration papers for something called Sterling Investments bank statements showing accounts I'd never heard of, and a letter that would change everything I thought I knew about my life. My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're finally ready to know the truth I've kept from you for 25 years. I've been investing our savings, every dollar we didn't spend, every small sacrifice we made to live simply. What started as a few $100s in a savings account became something much larger. We own 7 properties in Seattle, including the Capitol Hill apartment building where Victoria and Edward live. We own significant shares in 3 companies. The cabin was never just our family retreat. It was part of a portfolio worth $12 million. I kept this secret because I wanted Victoria to love us for who we are, not what we have. I've watched too many families destroyed by money, seen too many children who view their parents as walking inheritance checks rather than human beings deserving of love and respect. But if you're reading this letter, it means something has gone wrong. If Victoria is trying to take advantage of you, if she thinks you're helpless and defenseless, then she needs to learn what real consequences feel like. You have more power than she knows, my love. The choice of how to use it is yours. With all my love and faith in your strength, Thomas. I read the letter 3 times before the numbers began to make sense. $12 million. Thomas, my quiet bus driver husband who brought his lunch to work in a brown paper bag and darned his own socks, had been a millionaire. Had made us millionaires through decades of patient, invisible accumulation. Victoria thought she'd left me with nothing but Social Security and the kindness of neighbors. She had no idea she'd just declared war on one of the wealthiest women in Seattle. I sat in Thomas's desk chair, the same chair where he'd paid our bills every month, where he'd helped Victoria with her homework, where he'd quietly built an empire while I made dinner and watched the evening news. The rain continued outside, but inside our modest Ballard home, everything had changed. My daughter thought she was teaching me about financial reality. Tomorrow, I would begin teaching her about consequences. The next morning, I called James Morrison, the lawyer whose business card I'd found paperclipped to Thomas's documents. His name was familiar. I remembered him from the funeral, a tall man with silver hair who'd spoken briefly about Thomas's remarkable character and foresight. His office was downtown in the Columbia Center, all polished wood and expensive views of Elliott Bay. Mrs. Sterling. He stood when his secretary showed me, in his expression shifting from professional courtesy to something approaching reverence as he reviewed Thomas's papers. Your husband was, I have to say, remarkably astute and remarkably secretive. In 20 years of handling his affairs, I never suspected you didn't know the full extent of your holdings. Can Victoria legally sell my property? I asked, cutting through the pleasantries. The time for social niceties had ended yesterday in a hospital waiting room. Absolutely not. She used a power of attorney you signed during the funeral arrangements, but that document was specifically limited to handling immediate estate matters. It doesn't extend to major real estate transactions. Morrison's expression hardened slightly. We can reverse both sales immediately and pursue criminal fraud charges, if you wish. I thought about this, weighing the satisfaction of swift justice against something more educational. Criminal charges would be quick, clean, final. Victoria would learn her lesson in a courtroom with lawyers and judges to protect her from the full weight of her choices. But would she really understand what she'd done? Would she feel the helplessness, the betrayal, the casual dismissal of everything she'd valued? No charges yet, I said slowly. But I want everything back, quietly, and I want to know exactly what Edward's been doing with my daughter's life. Morrison raised an eyebrow, but nodded. I'll make some calls. It may take a few weeks to unravel everything, but Thomas set up the legal structure to protect these assets. Getting them back should be straightforward. Over the next 2 weeks, I lived 2 completely different lives. During the day, I was the pitiful widow my neighbors expected to see, gray-haired, slightly confused, struggling to cope with the practical realities of life without Thomas. Rosa Martinez from next door brought casseroles and gossip, her voice heavy with the particular sympathy reserved for the recently bereaved. It's just terrible what Victoria did, she whispered over our shared fence one afternoon, her dark eyes bright with the drama of other people's misfortune. Selling your father's truck like that. Everyone on the street knows how much Thomas loved that old Silverado. He washed it every Sunday after church, rain or shine. I nodded sadly, while inside, I felt something close to amusement. If only Rosa knew that Thomas's old truck was actually a classic that had appreciated significantly in value, or that I could buy a dozen such trucks without noticing the expense. And the cabin, too. Rosa continued, warming to her theme. That beautiful place on Whidbey Island where you and Thomas spent so many happy summers. To sell it without even asking you? It breaks my heart, Margaret. It truly does. Victoria made the decision she thought was best, I replied, carefully playing my role. She's trying to take care of me. But still, a daughter should ask her mother about such things. You have feelings, you have memories. These young people today, they think only about money. If only she knew how much money we were actually talking about. In the evenings, I studied Morrison's growing collection of reports like battle plans. Edward's financial situation was even worse than I'd suspected. He owed $180,000 to various creditors, banks, private lenders, and at least one organization that Morrison delicately described as non-traditional financial services. He'd systematically forged Victoria's signature on loan documents, used their apartment as collateral for increasingly desperate schemes, and had been quietly liquidating assets for months before their sudden departure for London. The investment opportunity in London was predictably non-existent. Morrison's contacts in the UK confirmed that Edward was a person of interest to several financial crimes units, and that he'd entered the country using documents that raised red flags with immigration authorities. He's running, Morrison told me during one of our evening phone calls. The London trip isn't about investment opportunities. It's about staying ahead of his creditors until he can figure out his next move. And Victoria probably has no idea. From what I can gather, he's been very careful to keep her isolated from the financial details. She likely believes everything he's told her about business opportunities and international investors. Morrison managed to reverse the cabin sale within 10 days. The buyers were a retired couple from Portland who'd been told that Victoria was helping her terminally ill mother liquidate assets quickly for medical expenses. When Morrison explained the actual situation, they were mortified and fully cooperative. They asked me to tell you how sorry they are, Morrison reported. They said they'd never have pursued the purchase if they'd known the circumstances. The truck took longer, but Morrison had connections in Seattle's collector car community. The man who'd bought Thomas's Silverado was someone Morrison had done legal work for, and one conversation about unfortunate family circumstances was enough to arrange its return. He's keeping it in climate-controlled storage until you're ready, Morrison said. No charge for the storage fees. He considers it a favor to Thomas's memory. Within 2 weeks, everything Victoria had sold was back where it belonged. She had no idea. In London, she was probably telling Edward how clever they'd been, how they'd secured their future, by making the hard but necessary decision to liquidate her mother's unnecessary possessions. The reports from London painted an increasingly grim picture. Edward was living well beyond their means in an expensive Kensington flat, running up bills that would consume the money from the property sales within months. He'd been seen around London's financial district spinning stories about American investment opportunities to anyone who would listen, but he had no actual business meetings, no legitimate prospects. More troubling were the reports about his personal life. Morrison's investigator had documented Edward's frequent visits to pubs and clubs, his obvious pursuit of women half his age, his growing indifference to Victoria's presence. The man my daughter had chosen over her own family was already planning his next move, and it clearly didn't include her. 3 weeks after they left, I received a postcard. Big Ben on the front, Victoria's handwriting on the back. Having a wonderful time exploring London. Edward's meetings with investors are going brilliantly. The opportunities here are incredible. Don't worry about money, we'll take care of you when we get back, love, V. The forced cheerfulness of the message was heartbreaking. I could read between the lines the slightly manic optimism, the repetition of Edward's promises about opportunities and investors. The way she signed with just an initial instead of Love, Victoria as she always had before. I showed the postcard to Morrison during one of our weekly meetings. He was becoming less formal as our professional relationship developed into something approaching friendship, the kind of relationship Thomas had apparently maintained with him for 2 decades without my knowledge. "She really has no idea, does she?" he said, studying the postcard. "None at all. Margaret, I have to ask, are you sure about this approach? When she finds out what you've done, what you could have prevented her from going through, she might never forgive you." I considered this possibility carefully. It wasn't the first time the thought had occurred to me. If she can't forgive me for letting her experience the natural consequences of her own choices, then she's not the daughter I thought I raised. And if the consequences are more severe than you expect, Edward's creditors aren't going to wait forever. When they can't find him, they'll come looking for her. Then she'll learn what it feels like to be truly powerless, to have people make decisions about your life without consulting you, to discover that someone you trusted has put you in danger. I met his concerned gaze steadily. "She'll learn what I felt like when I got that phone call in the hospital waiting room." Morrison nodded slowly. "I understand, but promise me something if this goes too far. If she's in real physical danger, you'll step in." "Of course. I want her to learn not to be destroyed." But even as I said it, I wondered if I would recognize the difference when the time came. The call came on a Thursday evening in late November, nearly 2 months after Victoria and Edward had left for London. I was in the kitchen, making myself a simple dinner, when the phone rang. Victoria's name on the caller ID sent my heart racing, though I kept my voice carefully neutral when I answered. "Mom." Her voice was different, smaller, frightened, stripped of the confident calculation that had characterized our last conversation. "Victoria, sweetheart, how are you?" "Mom, something terrible has happened. Edward, he's gone. He left me here with nothing. And there's this eviction notice for our apartment from some company called Sterling Investments. They claim we owe them money, but I don't understand how that's possible." Sterling Investments, the name Thomas had chosen for our holding company decades ago. I kept my voice carefully neutral, playing the confused widow, even as my pulse quickened with anticipation. "That sounds very complicated, sweetheart. What kind of money do they say you owe? Back rent, penalties, legal fees?" "It's over $30,000, Mom. I don't have $30,000. I don't have $3,000. Her voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. "Edward took everything. Our savings, the money from selling your things, everything we had. He spent it all, and then he just disappeared." "Oh, honey, are you coming home?" "I don't have any choice. I can't afford a hotel, and I can't reach Edward. His phone is disconnected. His email bounces back. It's like he never existed." She was crying now, the sound carrying across the Atlantic like a physical weight. "I'm flying back tomorrow. I know I don't have any right to ask, but could I stay with you for a few days, just until I figure out what to do?" The question hung in the air between us. Part of me wanted to end the charade right then, to tell her that everything would be fine, that I could solve all her problems with a single phone call. But a larger part, the part that remembered the casual cruelty in her voice when she'd announced the sale of my memories, held firm. "Of course you can stay here, Victoria. You're my daughter. That hasn't changed." The relief in her voice was painful to hear. "Thank you, Mom. I know I don't deserve your kindness after what I did, but I don't have anywhere else to go." After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the phone and thinking about the woman who would walk through my door tomorrow. She wouldn't be the same Victoria who had left confident, calculating, dismissive of her mother's feelings. This Victoria would be broken, desperate, grateful for any scrap of kindness. The question was, what would I do with her gratitude? Would I use it to heal the wounds between us? Or would I use it to deepen her understanding of what she'd done to me? Tomorrow, I would find out what kind of mother and what kind of person I really was when pushed to my limits. Victoria arrived at SeaTac Airport on a Friday evening, and the woman who walked through my front door was a shadow of the one who had left 2 months earlier. She'd lost at least 20 pounds from a frame that couldn't spare them her expensive clothes, hanging loose like borrowed garments. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually perfect hair hung limp and unwashed. When I opened the door, she hesitated on the threshold, as if unsure of her welcome. "Hi, Mom. Come in, Victoria. You look exhausted." She carried one small suitcase and a canvas messenger bag, all that remained of the life she'd built with Edward. As she stood in our living room looking around at the familiar furniture, with something approaching wonder, I realized she was seeing it through new eyes. This wasn't the outdated, slightly shabby home of an elderly widow anymore. This was sanctuary. We sat in the kitchen where Thomas used to read his morning paper, where I'd served thousands of family meals, where Victoria had once done her homework at the scarred oak table. Her hands shook as she accepted the tea I offered, and I noticed she'd lost her wedding ring, sold probably along with everything else of value she'd owned. "He took everything," she said quietly, staring into her cup. "The money from the cabin, from Dad's truck, everything we had in our joint accounts. He spent it all on that expensive flat, on restaurants and clothes and other things." "Other things?" Victoria's face crumpled. "Other women. He was seeing someone else, maybe several someone else's. A waitress at the pub downstairs, young enough to be his daughter. When I confronted him about the money, about why the bank accounts were empty, he laughed at me. He said I was naive to think he'd ever intended to stay married to someone past her prime." The casual brutality of it made my chest tight with sympathetic pain. Whatever Victoria had done to me, she didn't deserve that kind of humiliation. I was so stupid, Mom, so incredibly pathetically stupid. She looked up at me with eyes red from crying. "I sold your cabin. Our cabin, the place where we were so happy to fund his escape with another woman. I traded my family for a man who saw me as nothing more than a convenient source of financing." For a moment, my carefully constructed resolve wavered. She looked so broken, so genuinely devastated by the recognition of her own mistakes. It would be easy to end the charade now, to reveal the truth about our finances and make everything better with a wave of my metaphorical magic wand. But then I remembered the coldness in her voice when she'd called me from the hospital waiting room. The casual way she'd announced that my most precious possessions were now her capital. The dismissive tone when she'd told me I needed to be realistic about my situation. "You can stay here as long as you need," I said instead. "We'll figure out the apartment situation somehow." The relief on her face was painful to watch. "Really, after what I did to you? After the way I treated you, like you were just an obstacle to my plans? You're my daughter, Victoria. That fundamental relationship hasn't changed regardless of the mistakes you've made." What followed was 3 weeks of watching Victoria confront a world that didn't owe her anything. The first shock came when she tried to access her credit cards and found them all canceled or maxed out. Edward had been systematically draining their joint accounts for months. She discovered taking cash advances and making purchases she'd never authorized. "I don't understand how he could do this without my knowledge," she said one evening, surrounded by credit card statements and bank notices. "We were married. I trusted him completely." "Did you ever look at the statements, ask questions about large purchases?" Victoria flushed. "No. He said he was handling our finances so I could focus on my marketing work. I thought he was taking care of us." The second shock came when she tried to find work. Her marketing degree from the University of Washington should have opened doors, but Edward's financial crimes had created a web of legal complications that followed her everywhere. Background checks revealed pending investigations, potential civil lawsuits, and the kind of financial entanglements that made employers nervous. "I had 3 interviews this week," she reported one Friday evening, her voice hollow with defeat. 2 companies told me they couldn't hire anyone with potential legal exposure. The third offered me part-time work, answering phones for $8 an hour. "Are you going to take it?" "I don't have a choice. $8 an hour is better than nothing, and nothing is what I have right now." She took the job working 20 hours a week in a cramped office in Pioneer Square, answering phones for a property management company that specialized in low-income housing. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had once lived in luxury was now helping poor people navigate housing crises. But the $8 an hour wasn't enough to live on, much less pay the mounting debts that Edward had left in her wake. Victoria sold her jewelry, her wedding ring first, then the pearl necklace Thomas had given her for her 30th birthday, then the diamond earrings she'd worn to her college graduation. The pawn shops offered insulting amounts, but she took them anyway. "I got $400 for everything," she told me one evening, counting crumpled bills at the kitchen table. $400 for jewelry that was worth thousands. But I don't have the luxury of holding out for better offers. I watched her count and recount the money, and something twisted in my chest. Those pearls had been Thomas's gift to mark Victoria's entrance into full adulthood. He'd saved for months to buy them, working overtime shifts and skipping his usual morning coffee to accumulate the money. Now they were gone, reduced to grocery money by her desperate circumstances. The real crisis came 3 weeks after her return, when Victoria stumbled through our front door after her evening shift with tears streaming down her face and her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Mom, I need to tell you something terrible." I looked up from the book I'd been pretending to read. "What's wrong?" "Edward's creditors found me. They came to my office today, these men in expensive suits, who made it very clear they weren't the kind of people you ignore." She collapsed at the kitchen table, her face white with fear. "They say Edward owes them money, a lot of money, and that as his wife I'm responsible for his debts." "How much money? $200,000? Plus interest and penalties." Her voice was barely a whisper. "They gave me 2 weeks to come up with $15,000 as a good faith payment, or they're going to start taking assets." I felt my breath catch. Morrison had warned me that Edward's creditors might come looking for Victoria, but the reality was more frightening than I'd anticipated. These weren't bank representatives or collection agencies. These were people who operated outside the normal boundaries of law and civilized behavior. "What assets, Victoria? You don't have any assets." "They know about this house, Mom. They know you own it, and they're claiming that Edward used forged documents to put it up as collateral for some of his loans." She was shaking now, her words coming in gasps. "They can't actually take it, the documents are fake, but they can make our lives hell while the courts sort it out. They can put liens on the property, freeze bank accounts, make it impossible for us to live normally." The threat was real, even if the legal basis was false. Morrison had explained how predatory lenders operated. They relied on fear and intimidation rather than legitimate legal processes. They would make Victoria's life miserable, not because they had the right to, but because they had the power to. "I don't have $15,000, Victoria whispered. "I don't have $1,500. And now I'm going to lose your house too. Everything I touch turns to poison." She buried her face in her hands, sobbing with the raw despair of someone who had lost everything and was about to lose more. It was then that I realized the lesson had achieved its purpose. Victoria wasn't just sorry for getting caught or facing consequences. She was genuinely devastatingly aware of what her choices had cost other people. But as I reached out to comfort her, Victoria's head snapped up. Her eyes, red with tears, suddenly blazed with an anger I hadn't seen since she was a teenager. "No," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You know what? I can't do this anymore. Victoria, where have you been, Mom?" Her voice rose, edged with hysteria and rage. "I've been struggling for weeks, selling my jewelry for grocery money, working for poverty wages, and you just sit there. You watch me suffer, and you do nothing." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. "I'm letting you stay here. I'm supporting you. You're letting me—" She stood up, swaying slightly from exhaustion and stress. "I'm your daughter. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but you're my mother, and you're just watching me drown." The words came faster now, years of suppressed frustration and pain spilling out in a torrent. Do you know what it's like to call your own mother from a foreign country scared and broke and abandoned and hear nothing but cold politeness in her voice? Do you know what it's like to come home expecting comfort and finding this? She gestured around the kitchen at the careful distance I'd maintained, the emotional walls I'd built. Victoria, you made your choices, and you made yours. Her voice cracked with fury and heartbreak. You chose to watch your own daughter fall apart rather than help her. You chose to punish me instead of love me. What kind of mother does that? What kind of person sits there and watches someone they claim to love suffer when they could do something about it? The kitchen fell silent, except for her ragged breathing. Victoria stared at me with a mixture of rage and devastation that cut deeper than any confession of wrongdoing could have. I know I screwed up, she whispered, her anger deflating into something more complex and painful. I know I was selfish and stupid and cruel. I know I hurt you when you were already grieving and vulnerable, but you're supposed to love me anyway. You're supposed to help me because I'm your daughter, not because I deserve it. She turned toward the stairs, her shoulders shaking with exhaustion and defeat. Instead, you're as cold as I was. Maybe colder, because at least I was honest about my selfishness. Victoria, wait. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs but didn't turn around. There's something you need to know. The next morning, I drove Victoria to Morrison's office in Thomas's truck, the truck she'd sold, and didn't know I'd gotten back. She sat in the passenger seat, staring out at Seattle's gray November morning, her anger from the night before replaced by a hollow exhaustion that seemed to go bone deep. Why are we going to see a lawyer, Mom? We can't afford legal help, and those men made it clear they weren't interested in legal solutions anyway. Just trust me, I said, though I wasn't sure she had any trust left to give. Morrison's conference room felt different this time, charged with the weight of what was about to happen. Victoria sat across from me at the polished table, still wearing her uniform from the property management company, a cheap polyester blazer that hung loose on her diminished frame. The Victoria. Morrison began, his voice gentle in a way that suggested he understood the magnitude of what was about to occur. I need you to look at some documents. He slid a thick folder across the table. Victoria opened it with the mechanical movements of someone going through motions expecting nothing good. I watched her face as she began to read, confusion first, then shock, then a kind of stunned disbelief that made her look decades younger. I don't understand, she whispered, holding up a property deed with shaking hands. This says Mom owns our apartment building, the whole building. Keep reading, Morrison said quietly. She did, working through the stack with growing amazement. Bank statements showing accounts with 7-figure balances, stock certificates for companies I'd never heard of but apparently owned significant shares in. Property deeds for houses and commercial buildings scattered across Seattle like pieces of a vast invisible empire. $12 million, she breathed, looking up at me with eyes wide with shock. You're worth $12 million. I nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in my throat. But you let me... Her voice trailed off as the full implications began to hit her. You knew. When I called you from London, when I came home, broke when I was working those horrible jobs and selling my jewelry, you knew you could fix everything with a phone call? Yes. Victoria set the documents down carefully as if they might explode. Her hands were steady now, but her face had gone very pale. Why? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with hurt and betrayal, and the weight of 3 months of carefully orchestrated suffering. I thought about the explanation I'd prepared about consequences and education, and the importance of understanding one's actions. Instead, I found myself telling her the simple, terrible truth. Because I was angry. Because you broke my heart when you sold our cabin without asking, when you treated me like a burden to be managed instead of a person with feelings and memories and rights. Because you made me feel worthless and disposable, and I wanted you to feel the same way. Victoria flinched as if I'd struck her. So you orchestrated all of this? My suffering in London? My fear about losing your house, watching me humiliate myself for $8 an hour jobs, while you sat on millions of dollars. I thought you needed to understand what? Her voice was rising again, but this time there was something different in it. Not just anger, but a kind of devastated comprehension. That you're capable of the same cruelty you hated me for. That you can be just as cold and calculating as you accused me of being. The silence stretched between us heavy with mutual recognition. Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. There's more, he said gently. Margaret, should I tell her about Edward's debts? I nodded, feeling suddenly exhausted by the weight of my own deceptions. Your mother has already resolved all of Edward's legitimate debts. Morrison continued carefully. The men who threatened you yesterday, they have no legal standing. Their claims were based on forged documents that Edward created. We've been working with federal authorities to build a case against them for extortion and racketeering. Victoria stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. So the threat to our house was empty. They had no legal right to touch any of your mother's property. Morrison's voice was gentle but firm. Margaret made sure you were never in real physical danger, but she wanted you to experience the fear and helplessness that financial manipulation can create. You watched me shake with terror about losing your house, a house you could buy dozens of, because you wanted me to feel scared and helpless. Victoria's voice was flat, now drained of emotion. You let me think I was going to destroy the last security you had in the world, knowing it was all a lie. I wanted to defend myself, to explain about consequences and growth and the importance of learning from one's mistakes. But looking at Victoria's face, I realized how hollow those justifications sounded when weighed against the deliberate infliction of psychological torment. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in months. I thought I was teaching you something important, but I think I was just punishing you. And maybe punishing myself for not seeing who you'd become before it was too late. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents spread across the table, like evidence of a crime. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, older somehow. More careful. I did need to learn something, she said slowly. I was selfish and thoughtless, and I hurt you terribly. I sold your memories like they were just objects, treated you like you were just an obstacle to my plans with Edward. She looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen in years, genuine remorse rather than self-pity. But you could have taught me that lesson without the elaborate cruelty, Mom. You could have shown me these papers the day I came home from London, explained what I'd really done, and let me feel the natural shame of my actions. She was right, and we both knew it. Instead, you chose to watch me break. You turned my suffering into a teaching tool, and in doing so, you became someone I don't recognize. Victoria gathered the documents into a neat pile. The question is, what do we do now? Do we pretend this never happened? Do we go back to being mother and daughter, as if neither of us has learned anything about what we're capable of when we're hurt enough? I thought about Thomas, about the letter he'd left me giving me the power to defend myself. He'd trusted me to use that power wisely, but I wasn't sure I had. I don't know, I admitted. I don't know how we come back from this. Victoria nodded slowly. Neither do I. But maybe that's where we start, with not knowing, instead of pretending we have all the answers figured out. She stood up, smoothing down her cheap blazer with a dignity that hadn't been there 3 months ago. I need time to think about all of this. About what I did, about what you did, about who we really are when we're pushed to our limits. Victoria, wait, I'm not leaving, Mom. I'm just processing. This is a lot to absorb. She paused at the door, and for a moment, she looked like the little girl who used to come to me with skinned knees and hurt feelings. For what it's worth, I am sorry. For selling the cabin, for treating you like you didn't matter, for choosing Edward over my own family. I was wrong, and I hurt you, and I can't take that back. And I'm sorry too, I said, for letting my hurt turn into something calculated and cruel. For using your pain as an educational tool instead of helping you heal from it. Victoria nodded. Maybe that's enough for now. Maybe that's where we start rebuilding. The rebuilding took more time than either of us had expected. Victoria didn't speak to me for a week after the meeting with Morrison, processing the revelation of my deception and her own complicity in creating the situation that made it possible. When she finally emerged from her room, she was different, not broken, but changed in ways that seemed to go deeper than mere chastening. She quit the property management job, but kept working for 2 more weeks to fulfill her commitment to her supervisor, a woman named Janet, who had taken a chance on hiring someone with Victoria's legal complications. I made a promise, Victoria explained when I asked why she was continuing work she no longer needed. Janet believed in me when I had nothing to offer but willingness to work hard. I want to honor that trust, even though our circumstances have changed. It was a small thing, but it suggested a kind of integrity that hadn't been present in the Victoria who had sold my cabin to fund her European adventure. She enrolled in a social work program at Seattle Central College, saying she wanted to help other women who'd been financially betrayed by partners they trusted. When she told me this, I felt a complex mixture of pride and guilt. Is that because of what Edward did to you, or what I did to you? I asked. Victoria considered the question seriously. Both, I think. Edward showed me what it feels like to have someone you love use your trust as a weapon against you. You showed me what it feels like to have someone you depend on withhold help when they could easily provide it. Both experiences were educational. Her tone was carefully neutral, but I heard the edge in it. We were still finding our way back to each other, still learning how to be mother and daughter again, after discovering we were both capable of calculated cruelty when sufficiently provoked. The breakthrough came 8 months later during one of our careful dinner conversations. Victoria had been telling me about her classes, about the women she'd met who were struggling with abandonment and financial abuse, when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence. I've been thinking about the cabin, she said. My heart clenched. Victoria? No, let me finish. I've been thinking about why I sold it so easily without asking you, without even considering what it meant to our family. She set down her fork and looked directly at me. I told myself it was just a practical decision that we needed the money and you weren't using the place anyway. But that wasn't really true. What was true? I was angry at you. At Dad. At the fact that he died and left me feeling responsible for taking care of you when I didn't know how to take care of myself. Her voice was steady, but I could see the pain in her eyes. I sold the cabin because it represented all these family obligations I didn't want. I wanted to be free to start fresh with Edward, and you and your grief and your needs felt like anchors holding me back. It was the most honest thing she'd said since coming home from London, and it cut deep. But it also felt clean, like lancing an infected wound. And now, I asked, now I understand that freedom isn't the absence of obligation, it's choosing your obligations consciously, because they matter to you. She smiled, but it was a complicated smile that held both sadness and hope. I also understand that when you let me struggle, you weren't just teaching me about consequences. You were showing me what abandonment feels like from the other side. We sat in silence for a while, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Victoria spoke again. I want to do something meaningful with the money. With our money. Something that honors Dad's memory and maybe makes up for some of the damage we've done to each other. What did you have in mind? A foundation? For women who've been financially abused or abandoned? Not just emergency assistance, but education teaching them how to recognize the warning signs, how to protect themselves, how to build their own security, instead of depending on someone else to provide it. I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot of guilt and regret I'd been carrying since that day in Morrison's office. That sounds like something your father would have supported wholeheartedly. I think so too. And Mom. She reached across the table and took my hand, the first time she'd initiated physical contact since learning the truth about our finances. I want to run it from the cabin. If you'll let me have it back, not as punishment or reward, but as a place to do work that actually matters. The cabin where we'd been happy, where Victoria had learned to swim and identify birds, where Thomas had taught her to cast a fishing line, and I'd read to her from books about brave girls who saved the day. The cabin I'd fought to reclaim, and then hadn't known what to do with. Yes, I said, surprised by how right it felt. Yes, I think that's exactly what it should become. Victoria's foundation opened 18 months later. The Puget Sound Women's Recovery Center housed in our extensively renovated and expanded cabin, with residential space for 12 women and their children, classrooms for financial literacy and job training, and a counseling center staffed by therapists who understood betrayal from the inside out. Victoria lived there most of the time, managing the program and working directly with clients. I visited once a month, helping with administrative tasks, and sometimes sharing my own story with women who were struggling to trust again after being devastated by people they'd loved. The work wasn't just about money, though the foundation provided emergency assistance and comprehensive financial education. It was about helping women understand that they could survive the worst betrayals, that they could rebuild their lives, even after losing everything they thought they could count on. It was about teaching them that strength sometimes looked like accepting help, and sometimes looked like refusing it until the terms were right. Edward was released from federal prison after serving 3 years for fraud and identity theft. He sent Victoria a letter from a halfway house in Portland asking for money and a second chance. She showed me the letter before writing back, "I forgive you for my own peace, not for your benefit. I hope you find a way to build an honest life, but I won't be part of it. Please don't contact me again." When I asked if she'd ever considered reconciling with him, she shook her head immediately. "Forgiveness doesn't require me to trust someone who's proven himself untrustworthy. I can wish him well from a safe distance, but I'm not going to give him another opportunity to hurt me or anyone else." It was a lesson I was still learning myself. 3 years after the foundation opened Victoria, and I established a new tradition: monthly dinners at the center, sitting on the deck where Thomas used to grill salmon, and I used to read novels in the summer sunshine. We'd watch the ferries cross Puget Sound and talk about the women we'd helped, the progress they were making, the lives that were slowly being rebuilt from the ground up. During one of these dinners, as the sun set over the water in shades of gold and rose, Victoria asked me the question I'd been both dreading and hoping for. "Do you regret it? The way you handled everything when I came back from London?" I thought about this, carefully weighing honesty against kindness, and finding that for once they aligned. "I regret the cruelty. I regret letting my hurt turn into something calculated and manipulative. But I don't regret forcing you to face real consequences, and I don't regret discovering that I'm strong enough to protect myself when I need to. Even if it meant hurting me in the process, even then. Not because I wanted to hurt you, but because I needed to stop being someone who could be hurt so casually by the people she loved most." I looked at her across the table, this daughter who had become a stranger and then become someone new entirely. "What about you? Do you regret selling the cabin?" "I regret the way I did it without asking, without considering your feelings or our family's history. But I don't entirely regret the crisis it created, because that crisis taught us both things we needed to know about ourselves." She smiled, and this time it was purely genuine. "We learned that we're both stronger and more ruthless than we thought, and maybe in the long run, that's not entirely a bad thing." As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared over the sound, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again: contentment. Not the simple happiness of before, when our relationship was built on unexamined assumptions about who we were and what we owed each other. This was something more complex and more durable: the satisfaction of two people who had seen each other at their absolute worst and chosen to build something better from the wreckage. We found our way back to each other, not through forgiveness or forgetting, but through the hard work of acknowledging who we really were when pushed to our limits. We learned that love isn't always about kindness and generosity. Sometimes it's about having the courage to let the people you care about face the consequences of their choices, even when you have the power to rescue them from those consequences. And sometimes it's about having the wisdom to know when the lesson is complete, and the grace to help each other heal from the wounds that teaching and learning inevitably leave behind. The foundation has helped over 300 women in its 4 years of operation, providing them with the tools and support they need to rebuild their lives after financial betrayal. But its first and most important success story was teaching a mother and daughter that they could survive discovering the worst about themselves and each other, and still find their way back to something that looked like love, different from what they'd had before, more honest and more fragile, but ultimately more real.